All right, hello everyone. I'm excited to have a chance to talk to you about wheat, barley, and rye today. I forget that I have to hold down an extra key to move to presentation mode on this computer. Back in 2021, I did a guest lecture on this, so uh, it's something that I've actually spoken on in class before. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be any better on this lecture than I was on the previous ones, but I have worked quite a bit with wheat. I've worked a fair amount with barley, and I've worked a little bit with rye as well, so I hope you'll find this interesting. One of the interesting things about wheat, barley, and rye is that they're closely enough related to each other that you can actually cross them. Now, it may seem like a little bit of a juxtaposition, but wheat, the scientific name is Triticum aestivum, and rye, the scientific name is Cicale cereale, and barley is Hordeum vulgare, but don't worry about that for the moment. There is a reason that I'm telling you this. So you can actually cross barley with rye, and that's been done. They've been able to produce some hybrids from those crosses. You can cross barley with wheat, but you traditionally get sterile plants that come out of it. And you can cross rye with wheat. When you cross rye with wheat, the name that they have for that is triticale, and the way that they got that name is actually from the triticum from wheat and the cicale from rye, and they just put it together and mashed it into one word, triticale. So be aware of that, and because of that, many times it's difficult to, if you're just glancing at plants, to tell the difference between wheat, barley, and rye. Now, there are certain varieties of wheat, barley, and rye that you're never going to mistake for one another. But if you ever need a back of the envelope way of deciding whether you're looking at wheat, barley, and rye, generally speaking, barley is going to have one seed by itself. Rye is going to have a pair of seeds in a group, and wheat's going to have three seeds together in a group. So a little factoid for you. So we'll talk about the history, we'll talk about how they develop, we'll talk about what's led to yield increases over the last 70 years, we'll talk about management, and we'll talk about the harvest as well. Wheat is, of the three, the dominant one that we see grown throughout the world. It's popular because the gluten and the protein in the wheat allows it to fluff up and make really nice breads. It's also great for making pastas. Interestingly enough, you don't use the same wheat for bread that you do for pasta because they have different characteristics, and in some cases you want something with a high protein content, sometimes you want things with a low protein content. But it's also really popular for a lot of regional dishes. Barley, if you're growing for feed barley, your goal is to have high protein because you're feeding it to animals, and your goal is for them to be able to gain weight as quickly as possible. The way that you do that is through increasing the protein concentration. However, if you're growing barley for malt, you want it to be low protein. And so when I was in southeast Idaho, we used to grow feed barley, and many of our neighbors grew malt barley because we had some large plants, both Anheuser-Busch, and there was a Budweiser one. Trying to remember just the names on the fronts of all the buildings there, but all of those producers were growing malt barley. Now, a little factoid, in a bad management decision at one point, we were trying to grow malt barley to feed to our animals. Don't ask me why. That was not a decision that that I or my parents made, but it was working against us because they were genetically prone to low protein, and what you're looking for is high protein. But you see barley in malts, you see it in feed, you see it in some types of bread. Um, and then finally, rye. It also has gluten in it. It generally has a pretty good protein content. The biggest thing that you notice with rye, if you've ever had rye bread or other breads with rye in them, is that it has a bitter, kind of tangy taste to it. So a lot of times you'll see it in crackers, you'll see it in some types of bread, beer, and whiskey. Looking at when these crops really came into production, um, wheat, barley, and rye all had origins right generally around the Fertile Crescent and southern Europe. And people in Mesopotamia, which is right there in the Fertile Crescent, began cultivating and breeding wheat about 10,000 BC. This was one of the primary crops that established civilization. And by 7000 BC, you see wheat, barley, and oats growing in Greece. By 6000, they'd started milling them and toasting them. By 2500 BC, the Egyptians were cultivating wheat and barley, and very much you follow. You notice that as people began to produce these crops in these regions, they started to really hit the high points of civilizations within these groups. So, you look at Greece in 7000 BC, they were already establishing a pretty wealthy commercial economy because they were being successful growing seed. 2500 BC, that's when the Egyptians were really at one of their zeniths. And part of the reason for this is that these crops are pretty easy to grow. They get good yields, and they tend to be pretty tolerant of heat stress, and they're pretty competitive with weeds. And so you could be successful in growing them, and one person might be able to produce food for 50 other people. Whereas, if you're on a subsistence economy, everyone has to be growing food or they're going to starve to death. So as I mentioned, if you look at the grain crops that we have in production right now, wheat, barley, rye, and oats, they primarily started right here. Rye, as I recall, is just a little bit more up into this southern Europe area, but a lot of overlap with this region right here with Turkey, with Egypt, with here's Greece over here. Now, wheat, if you were to look at the plants that were bred to make wheat, the original ones didn't have the yield characteristics or even necessarily the shape that we have today. So this Aegilops tachyi, you can see, is very much individual seeds going up the stem here. The ancestor with similar characteristics to our modern wheat was called einkorn wheat, which I believe was a diploid. And over time, they actually have bred wheat to most wheat varieties that we have today are tetraploids. It looks like einkorn is a diploid. Here's a wild diploid. Here's a tetraploid, a hexaploid. So, and I may be mistaken. It may be primarily a hexaploid. They're tetraploid and hexaploid versions of wheat, but that's actually correct. It would be hexaploid because that's why the kernels are in threes. Okay, looking at barley. A lot of barley that you see even today is 2-row barley, but they also have 4-row barley, and they've tested 6-row barley as well. Rye looks a lot like wheat, and it doesn't look too much different from barley either. But wheat, if you had to narrow it down as far as we're able to tell, probably came out of Syria about 9600 BC. Barley came from somewhere in the Fertile Crescent about the same time. And then rye, they're saying it was actually in Turkey, which is up here, about 1800 to 1500 BC. So one of the interesting things is, and wheat is a remarkably drought tolerant plant, but in Egypt over time you saw a lot of wheat production, and then over time you see a transition and a shift from wheat production to barley production. And the reason was that as they continued to irrigate, the soils became gradually more and more salty in Egypt, and barley is less sensitive to salt stress than wheat is. And so gradually over time everyone switched the crop that they were growing because barley started to be the crop that was yielding better. Now, if you look at wheat production in the United States, we average, about 1.5 to 2 billion bushels of wheat per year, which would be, about 35 to 40 billion kilograms of wheat per year. So we produce a lot of wheat. Looking worldwide, we're number 5 in terms of wheat production throughout the world. China's number 1. They combine the entire European Union into one, which is, kind of unfair. And there are lots of countries together, but at the same time, they're small countries, so I guess they can do what they want. India, Russia, and the United States. You'll notice, and you've probably heard this on the news, that the war in Ukraine has disrupted wheat production. You'll notice that Ukraine's number 9 on the list, even though it's substantially smaller than China or Russia or the United States. In 2019, there were about 762 million tons produced. So here we were talking about kilograms and bushels. The 762 million tons would be about 762 billion bushels. So, not bushels, kilograms, sorry. So 762 billion kilograms. And you'll have to do the calculations to bushels because that's just a little bit hard for me this morning. And it's grown on over 500 million acres. Just to give you an idea, if I recall correctly, the entire size of the United States is about 500 million acres. I'm going to cheat here. Let's see. And I don't remember if that counts Alaska or not. Let's see. USA size acres. Let's see if they'll give us an answer here. Oh, 2.4 billion acres. So I was off. And then even if you subtract Alaska, that's, it's about 2 billion acres. But the total amount of wheat production area in the world is about a fourth the size of the United States. So if you look at wheat production in the United States, most of it's right here in the Kansas, Oklahoma, West Texas region, and then up in the northern states, South Dakota, Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and Washington and Oregon. When I was growing up, wheat production here in southeast Idaho was a big industry, and a lot of times they would rotate the production with potatoes. Looking at barley, you see a dramatic drop in the total quantity of barley produced versus wheat. You see a lot produced in Europe and Eastern Europe, You see a lot produced right here in southern Canada, but the total quantities are dramatically less. Rye production is another order of magnitude down from there. The European Union produces about 6 million metric tons of rye every year, as opposed to they produce 136 million metric tons of wheat and 63 million metric tons of barley. So, you can see the relative popularity of these as you move down. Most of the production of rye is going to be right here through this strip, Northern Europe, into Eastern Europe, into Russia here. So, European Union, Germany, Russia, and Poland are some of the big ones here. All right, let's look a little bit at the morphology of these, more so just because it's interesting to see, and it is another more accurate way of telling these apart. Auricles, if you look at a stem of a wheat or a rye or a barley plant, and if you look at the leaf surrounding the stem, you're going to see auricles are these little grasping fingers that go around the outside of the stem. The sheath is going to be the leaf that's surrounding the stem, and then the blade's going to be the portion that comes out and settles out from it. Many times you'll see a waxy sheath that's right here, and that's called the ligule. So barley is going to have these long auricles. They're going to be smooth. It's going to have a pretty noticeable ligule. Wheat, the auricles are not going to be as long. They're going to have hairs on them, and it's going to have a ligule. Oats, which we're not talking about as much, have the longest ligule that you're going to see among these plants. It doesn't have any auricles at all, and so when we used to scout wheat in southeast Idaho and we were looking for wild oats, what we would look for was, does it have these little auricles with the hairs on them, or is it smooth here? And we'd know immediately whether we were dealing with wheat or wild oats and whether we needed to arrange for a spray in the area. Wild oats were difficult to control because they were fairly closely related to wheat, and so a lot of the herbicides that you would traditionally use would either kill the wheat or they wouldn't kill the oats. There were only a few herbicides that worked well on the oats and didn't kill the wheat. And then rye is going to have an irregularly notched ligule, and so if you look at the ligule, it looks like someone took some shears to it and just kind of trimmed along the top of it, and kind of a ragged edge there. It's going to have some really small auricles, and then it's going to have little hairs on the sheath of the collar. And I'll get back to rye in a minute, talking about herbicides and in wheat production. Okay, looking at the growth stages, there are 3 different growth stage methods that they use with small grains like these. The one that we used to use was Zadex. Another popular one is Feeks. And the thing that's attractive about both of these is that they have their decimal or their numeric, and they work in groups of 10 or groups of 1. Feeks works in groups of 1. Zadex works in groups of 10. And so everything that is emergence related is going to fall between 10 and 20. As you get into tillering, that's going to be the 20s and the 30s. As it starts to grow upward and you start to see joints on them, it's the 40s through the 90s. And then when you get to, I was looking at the Feeks here, it's the 30s through the 39s here. And then once you get to boot, which is when the flag leaf comes out, that is the middle of the 40s. Heading and flowering is the 50s and the 60s. And all of these are designed around, you know, there are sub-stages within each of these where, you know, for instance, you know, 60 is going to be when you're in the dough stage, 50 is going to be when you're in the, let's see, I think as I recall correctly, and it's been 25 years since I've scouted wheat now, but 50s were when the head was coming up and anthesis was occurring, and then 60 was when it had actually gone through anthesis and it was starting to make the seeds, and then it just keeps right on going. And we would actually write these numbers on our scouting sheets for each week, and then at the end of the season you could look and see when the wheat was hitting different stages in different fields. And that was related to temperature, as you'll recall from when we were going through growing degree days. All right, looking at kernel stages, anthesis or flowering, you go out and you'll actually see these little pollen grains on the outside of the wheat plant. Then it moves to watery ripe, where it's really watery inside, starts out really small, but it just kind of grows from the bottom and up. So if you take this A, and if you took it prior to that, this collar thing right here would actually be down here, and it would look more flower-like, and over time it just kind of fills up to the top here. You move into a milk stage and then a soft dough stage where it gets more and more solid. Hard dough is where you hit the maximum dry weight and it's physiologically mature. And then after that, it dries down, ripens, and hardens. There are a lot of diseases that you run into with these crops, particularly wheat, just because it's grown on so many acres. Some of the ways that you can prevent these are rotation, fertility, weed control, and spraying fungicides and pesticides and herbicides as necessary. And you'll see two different types of particularly wheat, and I'll talk in terms of wheat, but realize that this can be applied to rye and to barley as well. If you have water available to you through irrigation, traditionally you fertilize a lot more, you do a lot more weed and insect control, and you use a lot of fungicides. With dryland wheat, many times you put it in the ground, you do minimal care of it during the season, and you rely on it and its ability to survive in a harsh environment to bring it to the end of a season. So a lot of the irrigated wheat that we worked with would have yields over 100 bushels to the acre. And you know, you go to England, they have yields that are even quite a bit higher than that. Our dry land that we looked at, a lot of times it was 10, 15, 20 bushels to the acre. Sometimes it would yield enough that they would harvest it. Sometimes they would decide it costs more in terms of fuel to go through the field than it does than what we're going to get into the basket. And so they wouldn't even try harvesting it. All right, if you have spring wheat, the water usage follows a pretty standard crop water usage curve where it ramps up to maximum around heading and flowering, then drops off to ripening and you harvest. Now, it's also common, especially in warmer areas, to grow winter wheat, and so you'll have a period where it ramps up. Then you'll go into the dormant phase where you're in the middle of the winter, and then it'll ramp up again in the spring and finish out in a fairly similar manner to what you have here. Generally speaking, for wheat and barley and rye, your maximum water consumption per day when you know, during the middle of the season is usually going to be about 0.3 to 0.35 of an inch a day. Which would 6 millimeters would be about well, let's see, 7 millimeters would be about 3/10 of an inch. 6 millimeters would be about 25/100ths of an inch a day. The one over here is in inches per week, and you see that it hits about 2 inches per week. 2 inches per week divided by 7 is, about 3/10 a day. So pretty similar for both of these. That's going to be pretty similar across the board with wheat, barley, and rice. We haven't talked about crop coefficients, but I'll just briefly explain this. So all the crop coefficient is how much water does a crop use relative to just a standard ET base crop. So what they do is they take a bunch of grass, they put a weather station over it, they see how much water that grass would evaporate, and then they just compare everything back to that. And so if you have a high crop coefficient, it means that the crop is using a lot of water relative to your standard. And if you have a low, you're not using very much water relative to the standard. So what you see is early season, you're using about 60% of the reference crop. When you hit this mid-season point right here that you saw right here in this region, you see this ramping up to now we're using 1.2 to 1.4 times as much water as the reference crop is, and then late season it drops back down. That's going to hold true whether you're looking at corn or rice or wheat or barley or rye. Most of these crops are going to have an early season where they don't use as much water. It's going to ramp up to flowering, and then it's going to start dropping off as you get into the seed development. And that actually is important if you're trying to grow barley, and if you're trying to reduce the protein content, you use less water early in the season, and then you pour more water to it later in the season, because reduced water increases protein. Remember, we said for malting barley you want to decrease the protein, so you actually push more water while the seeds are developing, whereas with wheat, where you're trying to get protein, you reduce the water during this period of time, which increases the protein. So you use roughly similar quantities of water in these cases, but with barley you're really pushing it during the milk to soft dough and the soft dough to hard dough stages. With spring wheat, you're pushing it early, and then you're doing a little bit more during the hard dough to harvest stage. In my experience, I didn't see a lot of people pushing this much water from hard dough to harvest, but it's comparable amounts here. But the places I really want you to notice are the differences at the very beginning, and then the differences within the milk to soft dough and the soft dough to hard dough stages. So on the exam, if I say, why might I irrigate malting barley more during milk to soft dough and soft dough to hard dough than spring wheat, you would say something like, oh, well, it's because you want less protein in malting barley. Some of the issues with having too much irrigation. First of all, if you over irrigate wheat, it'll get tall, it's going to lodge, which means it tips over, and you're going to lose yield. It's going to be difficult to harvest. And so if you're going after yield, and in some cases that's what your primary goal is with wheat, you want to irrigate until late soft dough. If you're going after protein, you want to decrease the irrigation a little sooner, because reduction of irrigation has been shown to increase protein concentrations. If you have a malt barley, again, you want to irrigate hard until you get into hard dough. If you've got feed barleys, then you treat them like wheat. So if we were to go back to this, and if I were to say, 2-row feed barley, you'd try to irrigate it a lot more similar to what you're doing with the wheat here. There are a lot of weeds in these crops, and you'll notice that a lot of these weeds are fairly closely related to wheat, barley, and rye because they're difficult to control. This looks a lot like that Igalops that we looked at the beginning, doesn't it? This is jointed goat grass, and it's a big problem. This is wild oats, wild rye, which we'll talk about in a second. You also see a lot of kochia, a lot of mustards that do pretty well within wheat and barley and rice systems as well. All right, so jointed goat grass and feral rye are really difficult to control in wheat because they're very closely related. In fact, both of them are actually able to cross with wheat, and then you've got problems that you introduce because it turns out, well, and this was a big problem that we ran into in Idaho. Producers got the idea because we were in a pretty harsh environment. Rye is even more cold tolerant than wheat is, so why don't we start planting rye? And that was okay in the first couple of years. Then they found that the market wasn't super great, but the bigger problem was that you're never going to be able to remove all of the seeds from the field, and those seeds came back up as what we called feral rye, and it gradually spread into all of the wheat fields, and it was extremely difficult to control in the wheat field because it was so closely related to wheat. We didn't have any herbicides that you could just spray to kill the feral rye. And so some of the options with these are spot spraying, where you just go in where you have patches of it, you just spray everything, and your goal is to kill all of the feral rye or all of the jointed goat grass. And if you get a little bit of wheat in the process, so be it. Wick applicators are popular because wheat is short, rye is tall, and so you wait until the rye comes up over the wheat, and then you actually drive through the field with a tractor or a four-wheeler or something else that's a platform for the wick sprayer. The herbicide is on this wick, and the wick brushes the rye and kills it, and it misses the wheat, and so you can control most of the rye that way. If you look at and you remember the hockey stick graphs that we showed for corn and for rice, you see these same things with wheat and with barley and rye. In the 1940s, we see this dramatic improvement in yields of all of these crops because there were a few major advancements at this time. First of all, shorter plants, which allowed them to fertilize more. That had a big increase. Also, more nutrient uptake and resource partitioning into the grains, which was pretty useful. Also, we had the introduction of herbicides about this time. We also had the introduction of disease-resistant varieties at this time. So a lot of things worked together to where we had dramatic improvements in yield during this period of time. So one of the ways that you measure, and we talked about this before, harvest index is the fraction of above ground biomass that goes into actual marketable yield, like seeds. And what you saw was a pretty dramatic increase in harvest index from the 1940s on up here. Now, there are other factors that have changed the yield of wheat, and there are even varieties of wheat that do pretty well that don't have the top harvest indices, but most of the increases in yield in wheat have been due to harvest index. All right, something else that is interesting, we talk about these in terms of their grains. They're also useful for forages. There are 5 small grain options for forage that you see: oats, winter wheat, winter barley, winter rye, winter triticale. If you are in the 3321 class, we'll discuss this in a little bit more detail, but just be aware that these are often grown for forages. on the side here, you see this man standing in this tall crop here. This is actually awnless wheat. So it's wheat that doesn't have awns, and awns are just those kind of hair-like or thread-like or stick-like protrusions that come off of the ends of the seed heads. And if you've ever walked around plants that have awns on them, you'll notice they stick in your socks. They're sharp. They're discomforting, and it's really difficult for animals to eat the plants. And so with awnless seeds, they're more palatable to the animals. All right, moving into harvest. One of the major reasons that wheat production became so popular in the United States is that they were able to come up with ways to harvest it rapidly. I'm going to quickly show you a large-scale harvesting here, if I can get this to play. They've got a huge header, and you'll see in the combine, and those of you who've run combines, you'll know as much or more about this than I do, but you have a big basket in the back where you're catching the wheat. You'll notice that they actually have it build up on the sides so that you can fit a whole lot in there. But while they're running, the entire purpose of this area here is just to catch wheat during the time that you don't have a buggy next to you that you're able to be dumping into. And most of these are going to have these seed trailers or buggies next to them on a regular basis, because the goal is, while the combine's running, you want it to be running non-stop, and you do whatever you can to keep it going through the field, because that's going to be the bottleneck in terms of being able to produce.
Hi, Big Tractor Power fans. In this video, we're going to spend time out in a Western Kentucky winter wheat field during the 2019 harvest with a John Deere 9420R four-wheel drive tractor and Kinsey 1105 grain cart. We'll see these big machines work alongside Class 9 John Deere S790 combines, harvesting 45 feet of wheat at a time with...
All right, so just to give you an idea, the combine is probably close to $500,000. The tractor is probably about $350,000 to $400,000, and the cart is not cheap either. And so, you know, they spend a lot of money, but the reason is that they're able to cover a lot of ground and a lot of yield rapidly. And so one of the interesting things that you'll see that in the U.S., because labor costs have always been quite a bit higher than they are in most other countries, we've moved to mechanization, and the way that we've been able to remain competitive in terms of productivity is through mechanization, whereas in India, for many years, their goal was they may remain competitive because they had a much lower cost of labor. All right, let's see if I can go to the next slide here. Post-harvest technology. I'm not going to show a lot of this video, but just be aware that these are available to you. I think that you'll enjoy them, and I can't even get this video to play right now, so there we go. Here's an example of operating a grain silo. As I recall, the language may even be like German or something on this, or maybe it's British English. But in terms of the quality of the video, it was the best thing that I had seen when I grabbed this a couple of years ago.
Vivesia's grain silo can hold 43,500 tons. It optimizes the cooperative's logistics and service to farmers.
Anyway, watch through it as you're interested. I'm not going to test you on individual parts of these videos, but I do think that this is pretty fascinating in terms of the storage. They talk about the need for temperature control. Here they're showing how they do their bushel weight or their specific gravity. They show about the storage, temperature, moisture, etc., how they move grain in and out. It's pretty fascinating. A few things that you should be aware of. If you're working in and around grain, make sure that you're wearing N95 masks and other protective equipment that you're told to wear, because grain dust can have long-term impacts on your lung health. Grain bin explosions are a real thing. You get all this dust together and a spark can actually set it off, and the reason that we eat grain is because it has lots of energy in it, and if you apply a spark to lots of energy, it can make bad things happen. Let me see if I can pull up this Dude Perfect video real quick where they actually show what can happen with a spark with a bunch of flour. Here, you can come over and watch if you want, Lauren. See if I can get this to work here. It's taking it a second to load. Apparently my home internet is slow. Oh, I'm going to exit page because I don't want to mess up my lecture here. But they actually got the bright idea of trying to...
Don't know this, but Dude Perfect was almost never a thing. Because there was a day that we almost all died. What's up, guys? Welcome to Bromo. Guy things in slow-mo. Beard. Let's explode some flour, they said.
Yeah, we didn't realize it was flammable!
Here we are, our naive little selves trying to capitalize on the slow-mo trend sweeping the globe. Luckily, an angel, in the form of the phantom camera operator, says to us, "Hey, don't you guys maybe want to stand a little bit further back, because I'm pretty sure flour's flammable?" And we think the explosion might be contained, somewhere right in this region.
And a nice cloud of powdery flour.
That we could almost just run through as it happens.
I definitely thought we could.
Unfortunately,
no! Boom! Vaporize! Let's give a 2-second clap to that guy. Deserved more, honestly, but yeah. We'll go 2.
I do think he deserved more.
Alright, so grain bin explosions are a real thing. It's also, there's risk of suffocation in grain bins, and so if you're working in and around these, make sure that you're very careful and cautious about what you're doing here. Alright, so just to summarize everything from the lecture, wheat and barley were among our first domesticated crops, and they came from the Fertile Crescent region, Mediterranean. Wheat is the 3rd largest crop in global production. All of these are C3 plants. I don't recall if we talked about that, but remember, rice was C3, wheat, barley, rye are all C3, corn is C4, and yields have increased due to changes in crop morphology, fertility, weed control, disease resistance, and we have really good harvest and storage technology. All right, have a great day, everyone. And I will keep talking until I can turn this off, because I know that this is